these things that have gone before were the talk of the country. Wherever you went, you heard of misery and want. The Luddites had the approval of the people. Not, of course, everybody, but the working man, even those whose own handicraft was not threatened by the new frames, favoured the Luddites. I do not know how it came about, but I was soon made aware that I was well regarded. When I went to chapel at Powell, people made way for me as though I was somebody. For me, I hated most genuinely the secrecy and underhandedness of the thing. I dreaded meeting my cousin George, but I knew it had to be done. My mind was fully made up to tell him I could not continue by his side on this organised attack on machines. The objection to machinery was that it displaced human labour. Well, I argued, a scythe is a machine, so is a pair of scissors. If I proposed to do away with the scythe at hay time and clip our 3-acre field with my mother's scissors, everyone would think me a lunatic. But somehow, as I walked down to the brig to have my talk with George, I got less and less comfort from my logic the nearer I grew to Huddersfield. George was at home, in a towering rage. I could not have found a worse time for my errand.
You're just the man I wanted to see, Ben. I feel I must talk to somebody and let steam off a bit.
Whatever's up, George? Do sit down and talk quiet and sensible. One would think you'd lost your wits, and I particularly wanted a quiet talk.
Listen here. I'd been up to Linfit, and we're coming along the road back to the cropping shop. I'm just above the Warren House by Radcliffe's plantation when I saw a woman about 30 years old crouched against the wall. I could see a pair of men's shoes sticking out from underneath her skirt, and it's my belief she'd nowt on her but just that shirt and an old thin black shawl. She was crying and moaning and rocking herself to and fro, and she'd a bundle of something in her arms. I didn't know her, but I stopped to see what ailed her. She'd been down to Huddersfield to see the relieving officer. Her husband was a cropper. He'd been thrown out of work. His master had put in 2 frames, so he'd had to leave. He's down with the rheumatic fever. They'd nowt to eat or drink. She'd been suckling the baby, and as time went on, she'd no milk in her breast for the little un. She'd fed it for days by soaking a rag with warm milk and water and let it suck on that. And then it had the convulsions, and she'd had to leave a man raving with the fever and hug the brat to Huddersfield, and there they had nowt for her. She opened her shawl, and as I'm a living man, there were the little one with a head no bigger than my fist, stark dead at its mother's breast. Its eyes were staring and staring, and its face was all drawn with pain. It made my heart stand still, and I felt as if a strong man were clutching my throat. I stood there before her mute. Just then I heard the sound of a horse's trot, and I turned round, and there were a horseful of Ottywells coming up the road. I don't know what possessed me, but I grabbed the child from its mother's arms and stepped right in front of his horse. He swerved and he swayed in the saddle.
Damn you! Mind where you're walking! Stand aside and leave the road free, you drunken tramp!
I stood in front of his horse and held up the child above the horse's head, and I thrust it right in his face. I said, "Look at thy work, William Horsfall, look at thy work and be glad."
Out of my way, you villain!
And then he drew his mare up onto its haunches and lifted his stock high in the air and brought it down with all his might, right across my face. Then he dug his spur into the mare and sprang off with a bound up the road.
I've marked you, George Mellor. I've marked you, and you know for what you are. You've not heard the last of this.
But I cared nothing for what he said. I gave the wee body back to its mother and all the brass I had on me. As the Lord's above me, that blow shall cost William Horsfall dear.
You won't like my errand, George, but I've settled to tell you, and tell you what's on my mind.
Well, what is it, lad? I'm easier now, I've had me say.
You know what's fixed for next Saturday?
I do that, Ben, and all goes well with that. I've had word that a big force from Leeds will join us near Rolfolds, and some will be there from Bradford and Dewsbury. The movement's spreading, lad. It's spreading and it's growing, and the time's at hand when General Ludd will have an army that'll sweep all before it.
I shall be there, George.
Of course you will, Ben. Those doors of Cartwright's will stand some braying, but you can splinter his panels and burst his locks, I'm thinking.
I will be there, George, for my word's past. But after that night, you must do without me.
You'll not turn tail, Ben. Why, the Visory's at hand, man. One blow and the game's our own.
I'm no traitor, George, but it hurts me to tell thee. I know what you say about the suffering of the poor, but we're on a wrong tack, George. Enoch's not going to stop machinery. The masters are stubborn. We may break 1,000 frames and clear every machine out of every mill and shop in England, but better ones will take their place. We cannot go on forever with midnight raids and secret meetings. The law's too strong for us, George.
Then what would you do, Ben? Are the working classes to sit down and watch their families die by inches? If you don't like my methods, tell me better. I don't like stealing about like a thief any more than you do. But this is only the beginning, Ben, only the beginning.
And the end?
We'll strike higher and further. Before many weeks are over, I'll throw off all disguise. I'll call on every man that has a heart to join me, and we'll march with swelling ranks till we stand an army at the very gates of Westminster. And there we will thunder for our claims and wring from an abject parliament the rights without which we are driven slaves.
And have you counted the cost, George?
Aye, that I have. If we succeed, who can tell what we may not accomplish? These cruel, lagging wars that